We are starting a new series today, a 5-part series that we want to talk about how we can know that Jesus is alive. It's a fantastic claim that Christians make that the one that they follow was a man who lived, who died, and was raised back to life. Now that's a fantastic claim to be made, and because of that, there are some people that become skeptical, they become cynical, they say that sounds almost too fantastic for me to believe. There was a man who believed that. He was in that camp of being a cynic and was completely intolerant of those that were Christians. In fact, so incensed was he by their beliefs that he went out of his way to persecute them. He did everything in his power to dissuade them from their belief in Jesus until he saw the light for himself and came to the realization that Jesus was who he said that he was, and that everything about him was true just as his followers had been claiming. And talk about a 180-degree about face. And now, just as adamantly as he had been persecuting, he was now going out and proclaiming that Jesus truly did die on a cross and was raised back to life. At one point, he found himself in Athens. Athens, at this point, was a very important city in the Greco-Roman world. It was not only the center for the philosophical thought of the day, this is where the philosophy of the era was coming from, but it was also the home city for many of the Roman and Greek deities. And so their centers of worship were there in Athens as well. And so this convert, this guy who's done this about face, his name is Paul, he had an opportunity to speak to a bunch of these philosophers. And in his concluding remarks, he says this: "Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead." There's the main proof, by raising Jesus from the dead. Now here's the response. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." Some of them sneered, and some said, "I'd like to know a little bit more." And so here's what I'd like to do today. I know that there's a lot of people that are in that first camp, that they say, resurrection from the dead sounds like a myth, fairy tale, sounds like a something that's just made up, that can't be historical reality. And for those people, what I would say is, could you just indulge me for just a couple of moments? Would you just, for just a couple of minutes, just be in this second group and say, I'd be willing to hear a little bit more the evidence that you have to present in this case. See, when it really comes down to our belief system, regardless of what it is that you believe, whether you believe in the claims of Christianity, or you believe some other religion, or you believe no religion at all, there's really three things that it comes down to. That there is an unreasonable faith. An unreasonable faith says, in spite of the evidence, I'm going to continue to believe what I believe. Even though somebody shows them evidence that says, well, hold on, what you're believing, it's really hard to believe that because of, that in spite of that, they say, I'm not even going to pay attention to that. I'm just going to, even though you've shown me this evidence, I'm going to continue to believe what I believe. There's a second type of faith that is blind faith. And that's the one that says, I don't need any evidence at all. I'm going to believe it just because I believe it. Blindly follow it, blindly believe it. Now, a lot of people who are cynics or very skeptical of the claims of Christianity would say that Christians fall into one of these two camps. They would say, well, you're just blindly believing something, or even though there's other evidence around you, your faith has become, it's an unreasonable faith. It just doesn't really hold water. But there is a third type of faith that I believe that we can all get to. It's a reasonable faith where we say, I'm going to believe in this because of the evidence. Now, unreasonable faith in spite of opposite evidence, I believe it. Blind faith, no evidence at all, but I'm still going to believe it. But reasonable faith is because of the evidence. Now, this is really, if you think about in a courtroom setting, if a prosecutor is trying to make his or her case and say, this person that's on trial, I'm going to present evidence to the jury to make my case that this person really did what I'm claiming that they did. The jury ponders that evidence, and the judge will usually send the jury off to their deliberations with that kind of instruction. They'll say, you need to weigh this evidence, put it on a scale, and you need to weigh it, and you need to say, is this reasonable? Is there reasonable information that's been presented here, reasonable evidence that would allow you to come to that conclusion that this person did what the prosecutor was saying that they did? And so that's what we want to try to present, is reasoned evidence. Now, for part of my evidence that I want to present, I'm going to use this book. It's a historical book that people refer to as the Bible. It's not a series of fairy tales. It's not a series of made-up stories. It is a historical document. In fact, I use that term not lightly. I'm not just throwing it out there, because we can make the case that historians that were writing at the same time that biblical accounts were being recorded, and historians that have studied other parts of the culture, archaeological finds, and many other sciences outside of, have verified what is claimed in the Bible. The Bible contains an accurate depiction of real historical events. In fact, I feel comfortable saying that the Bible is the most verified, the most scrutinized, and the most vetted historical book that exists on the planet. Now, I want to give you just one. We're going to mainly talk about some of the historical accounts that I want to look at are mainly going to focus on the New Testament, the AD side of the timeline. So I want to give you just a couple of thoughts, and this is by no means exhaustive, just a couple of really quick thoughts to just kind of make the case that this Bible, this book, is a historical document that we can refer to. I want you to see this. Of the 5,800 plus Greek New Testament manuscripts that we have, they amount to about 2.6 million pages. If you were to stack those up, it would be about a mile high if you stacked up all the pages. Now, if you compare that to many of the other historical documents from around the same era as the New Testament, we have far fewer manuscripts and far fewer pages in those manuscripts, only about 4 feet of manuscripts if we add that up. We just have little scraps, little pieces from here and there of those manuscripts that date back to that time. Now, I understand that just because you have a lot of something doesn't necessarily make it right. When somebody says, well, a lot of people believe this, so it must be right. That's not necessarily true. But there is something to be said about the amount of evidence that we're considering when we're talking about a biblical record versus the amount of evidence we're considering when we're looking at another historical document. Now, let me give you another way to look at this. On this chart here, this far right-hand column is some of the manuscript numbers that I was just talking about. But over here on this side, on the far left, we're talking about, and this chart, by the way, it's in that printed thing. It's on YouVersion. We'll make it available online as well for people to look at later. But these are some of the best known historical works during this same time period. We have Homer's Iliad, Herodotus' Histories, Plato's Tetralogies, Caesar's Gallic Wars, Livy's History of Rome, Tacitus's Annals of Roman History, and Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. Those are all readily attested to by historians as historical documents. But here's one of the things that I want you to notice. This column right here shows you the date that they were written, but then the next column over here shows us the date for the oldest manuscript we have, one that is as close to the date of the actual events that we can find. Now you'll notice that Homer's Iliad, 400-year time gap. Even if we come down here, one of the Thucydides, it's 200 years. Now let's put this in perspective. Let's say in the founding of the United States, one of our key founding fathers was George Washington. Okay? And so he is living in the 1700s. Let's say that the first biography that we can find, the first written account of his life that we can find is from 1900. 200 years after the events took place. You say, well, wasn't there other things going on at that time? Well, yeah, but we can't find them. We don't have them. But if we look down here at the New Testament documents, we see that the earliest writings are taking place around AD 50. So it means 20 years after Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension. But we only have another gap of about 50 years for the earliest manuscript that we can find. In addition to that, as we already said, if you come all the way over here, you can see that Homer's Iliad is the one that we have the most for at 1,800 plus copies. But when you come down here to the New Testament, and especially the Greek New Testament, that's kind of the trade language that things were written in to take around the world. But you combine those two together, we have over 23,000 copies of manuscripts compared to less than 2,000 here. Certainly there's a lot more evidence, and I'd be willing to have that discussion with anybody. There's a lot of things that we can look at, as I mentioned, archaeology and other contemporary writers that were writing at the same time as the biblical writers to make the case that this is a historical document. But we want to go through this process and be able to say, I know that Jesus is alive because of, and we're going to use all 5 of these letters of alive. And today, the letter A stands for apologetics. Apologetics. Now, apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which means to make a defense, but it really, and if you look in the dictionary, it's a reasoned presentation of evidence. It's saying my evidence is laid out. It's not an emotional response. It's not just, well, I really want this to be true. It's courtroom level saying, I want you to just coldly, logically look at my case and just use your brain. You don't have to use anything else but use your brain. It's not an emotional appeal. It's a mental appeal to lay out the case. And that's what we're talking about with apologetics. Now, specifically, we're looking at, I know Jesus is alive because of the apologetics. Well, if we think about that, so here's the claims that Christians have made. Jesus lived, he died on a cross, he was in a grave, and then he was raised back to life. That's the fantastic claim that a lot of people go, you kind of lose me there because I've just never heard of anything. That sounds science fiction. It sounds mythical for that. So let's break it down this way. There's three ways that we consider it. Number one, we could consider the thought that Jesus didn't actually die. That is a possibility. If we're claiming, if Christians are claiming that Jesus is alive now, then you could go back and say, well, the possibility is that he didn't actually die, and so that's why he's alive now. So let's look at we're going to look at some of the historical accounts that are in the Scripture. But let me just set the stage for you this way. Jesus died by crucifixion. Crucifixion was not invented by the Romans, but it was perfected by the Romans. It became one of the most horrific forms of torturous death that history has ever recorded for us. Many times people who were crucified, it would take them days and days to die. They would die from exposure, or they would die from dehydration. They were completely vulnerable, completely unable to defend themselves or provide for themselves. So it's actually somewhat merciful that Jesus died rather quickly from his crucifixion, and that's because of the torture that he went through and the loss of blood and the beatings that occurred prior to his crucifixion. But the crucifixion victim would be, unlike you've probably seen it in TV shows, it typically wasn't a wooden cross like this one that was laid on the ground and then they were nailed to it. The vertical pole was usually just already in the ground. But they would be laid on the ground and their arms stretched out on a crossbeam, and spikes were driven through the victim's wrists. Medical science will tell you that the bones in the wrist are strong enough to support the weight of the body. Nails in the palms wouldn't, but it's not the palms where the nails went. It went through the wrists. We have uncovered skeletons that show the scratches on the radius and ulna bones where that spike went through. And even though the Romans were famous for recycling all of their things, they would reuse all of their wood and their nails. Apparently with one of their victims, they had a hard time. The nail must have been kind of stubborn because the skeleton was discovered with not only the spike still through the wrist, but a piece of wood on the other side with the spike in there. And that's how we've pieced this together throughout history. After they were nailed to that crossbeam, the crossbeam would be lifted up onto the vertical pole where the victim was suspended in the air with all of the weight of their body hanging on two spikes through their wrists. The victim's legs would then be slightly bent and the ankles crossed and another spike driven through all of the ankle bones into the wood. In that position, as you're hanging, the weight of your body across your chest would make breathing incredibly difficult. So just the natural drive to survive that's inside of our bodies, at some point the victims would reflexively, even though it was incredibly painful with that spike through their ankle bones, would push their body weight down on their ankle bones to get relief off of their chest so that they could suck in some air and try to exhale it as well before they would slump back down. And again, at that point, breathing became incredibly shallow. So in that position, like I said, many of them totally exposed to the elements, unable to provide them for themselves, would hang there sometimes literally for days before they would succumb to exposure or dehydration. A group of medical examiners read the account in the scripture of the crucifixion of Jesus. And after reading that account, they put together this summary to explain what they found here. The difficulty surrounding exhalation leads to a slow form of suffocation. Carbon dioxide builds up in the blood, resulting in a high level of carbonic acid in the blood. The body responds instinctively, triggering the desire to breathe. At the same time, the heart beats faster to circulate available oxygen. The decreased oxygen, due to the difficulty in exhaling, causes damage to the tissues, and the capillaries began leaking watery fluid. I highlighted that because we're going to come back to that in a second. Leaking watery fluid from the blood into the tissues. This results in a buildup of fluid around the heart. It's called a pericardial effusion, and the lungs, a pleural effusion. The collapsing lungs, failing heart, dehydration, and the inability to get sufficient oxygen to the tissue essentially suffocate the victim. The decreased oxygen also damages the heart itself. That's called a myocardial infarction, which leads to cardiac arrest. In severe cases of cardiac stress, the heart can even burst, a process known as cardiac rupture. And then this last line, Jesus most likely died of a heart attack. Most likely died of a heart attack. The heart just simply couldn't keep up with it. And again, as I mentioned, because of the beating and the flagellation that the Romans put Jesus through, the loss of blood prior to crucifixion even starting would have been so horrific. His body would have already been going into shock at the time that he was crucified. It really was only a matter of time before the heart would fail. Now, those two phrases that I wanted you to see, the leaking of the watery tissue, the water into the tissue, and then this buildup of the fluid around both the heart and the lungs. There was a man who stood there at the base of the cross and was an eyewitness to the crucifixion. He watched everything that took place, and he wrote down his remarks. His name was John. And in his account in the Bible, he said, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water, bearing witness to what those medical examiners had said. Because of the leaking of the fluid around both the pericardium around the heart and the pleural lining around the lungs after Jesus' body had slumped down. I want you to imagine for a minute, if you went to visit a loved one or a family member and you walk through the door of their house and you see that loved one on the floor in a pool of blood. More than likely, your response would be, well, they're a goner, and you just leave. Right? Because you care for them, you are going to rush over to them and you are going to frantically check for any signs of life at all that you can find. Is there a pulse? Is there a heartbeat? Are they breathing at all? Is there anything that I can do to try to rescue them? You're going to make every effort to make sure that your friend, your loved one, survives this. Well, Jesus as well, his body, after he was dead, his body was handled by not only soldiers, but also handled by his friends as well. John further writes in his account that after Jesus had died and he comes down off the cross, later Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jews. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. Okay? In other words, here's two men that love Jesus. Their hands are on his body. If Jesus had, as some people, we're saying a possibility that Jesus didn't actually die, these men would have had an opportunity to check for signs of life. They would have been able to say, he's groaning. There's a faint heartbeat. I felt him move. I saw his chest rise. He's still struggling to get oxygen into his lungs. This is not a quick process to prepare for burial. It's a slow process of wrapping him with these cloths and laying these spices on his body as well. Now, not only his friends, but the Romans as well. There would have been a squad of probably 4 Roman soldiers plus a centurion that would have overseen the crucifixion. If they failed, if Jesus had survived the crucifixion attempt, the Roman government would have required their death for the fact that they didn't follow through on what they were supposed to do. So Mark's gospel, Mark's historical account records this about Joseph and Nicodemus. Joseph of Arimathea went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. And when he learned from the centurion that it was so, then he said to Joseph and Nicodemus, as we just read, fine, you can take the body. Before his friends even had a chance to handle his body and look for signs of life, Roman soldiers who, if they were wrong and he wasn't actually dead, it would cost them their life. They already had their hands on him and already verified that he had indeed died. Okay? In addition to the friends and the soldiers, we also have some contemporary historical accounts by people who were not friendly to Christians at all. The first one is a man by the name of Tacitus. We mentioned his name earlier. It's one of his Annals of Rome, is one of the historical documents we looked at earlier. The Romans were no friends of Christians. In fact, you know that their persecution of Christians was legendary with the way that they fed them to the lions in the Colosseum. And yet Tacitus, in his historical document, said, Christus, from whom the name Christianity had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, that was the Caesar at that time, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. Okay? Tacitus, unfriendly to Christians, said Jesus died at the order of Pontius Pilate. Another man, now if you remember, that Jesus was brought to Pilate by Jewish leadership, specifically those that were in the priesthood. Another writer, a historical writer at this time, his name is Josephus. Josephus's family are from the priestly line, the people that didn't like the followers of Jesus. They thought that Jesus was perverting and corrupting their pure Jewish faith. They didn't like Jesus. They didn't like Christians. Paul, the man who did the about face, he used to be one of those people that didn't like Christians. And so Josephus writes this in his historical account. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross. Even Josephus, Tacitus, two people unfriendly to Christians, confirmed that Jesus went to the cross. Roman soldiers, friends of Jesus, medical examiners confirmed it's highly unlikely this claim that Jesus didn't actually die. Now, the other claim then that we could make, if Jesus didn't actually die, is we could say, well, he didn't actually rise from the dead then. He died and he went into a tomb, but he didn't come back out of that tomb. That could be a possibility. Now, some of the theories that are given for this is either a myth or a story that Christians concocted because they wanted to try to save face. Or some people say that they were delusional from their grief. When they said that they saw Jesus, it was just a hallucination. Now, here's the problem with the hallucination one. We can cover that one pretty quickly. If one person came and said, I saw him, and that was it, right? Well, that's a little hard to verify. But one person sees him, and then two people together see him, and then another group of people see him, and then somebody else sees him after that, and all of them are seeing the same thing and telling the same story and corroborating what other people have said. The theory of them being delusional or of just imagining it or having some kind of hallucination begins to break down. Group hallucinations at multiple times over a span of a month plus just really kind of breaks down. So let's look at the idea of this was a story that was created. Now, there's some followers of Jesus, some people that had been intimate with him and spent time with him that just said, I'm not going to take anybody else's word for this. People are saying this. Now, John records this account. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came, stood among them, and said, Peace be with you. After this, he showed them his hands and his side, and the disciples were overjoyed when they saw him. Now, one of the guys wasn't there. His name was Thomas. Now, some people call him Doubting Thomas. I tend to call him Thomas who needed some evidence. He wasn't doubting. He just simply said, and it's recorded here, when they start talking to him, they're like, we saw Jesus. Thomas, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came, so the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it. I'm not going to believe it just because you said it. Okay? Now, this is one of the guys that would supposedly, according to the theory of creating a myth or a legend, this is supposedly one of the guys on the inside that would want to do this. And he wasn't saying, hey guys, we'll never be able to pull this off. That's not what he was saying. He said, I'm not going to believe it unless I see it for myself. Well, then it says, a week later, 1 week later, okay, we have a group of people that are no longer grieving, right? So you can't say that, well, they're hallucinating or seeing things because of their intense grief. It's a week later. They're not grieving anymore. The disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came, stood among them, and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out your hand, put it into my side, stop doubting, and believe." And Thomas then, when he had a chance to actually touch Jesus, Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." This is the real thing. And now that I've had a chance to see this for myself. Now the other thing to consider as well, I kind of mentioned this earlier under the heading of maybe Jesus didn't actually die. Now remember, the Romans are under penalty of death. They got to make sure that Jesus is dead. Well, after they verified that he's dead and he goes into the grave, now what's the other thing? Well, the disciples might steal the body. So now the Jewish leadership is concerned about this. And so they go to Pilate, and they said to Pilate, so we remember, and this is recorded in Matthew's gospel, they said, we remember that this guy said that he was going to come back to life. And we think that his disciples may come and steal his body. So now notice, they're not claiming that he didn't die. He's dead, he's in the grave, but we think that they're going to come and steal the body. And so they're saying to Pilate, so, what can you do about this? So Pilate answers, "Go take a guard, make the tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting a guard. Big stone across the tomb, wax seal on it, okay? You break that seal, you're in big trouble. And there's armed guards standing outside. As the story continues, there's an earthquake. An angel shows up. The stone rolls away. These battle-hardened soldiers fall on the ground. Their legs turn to jelly. They're so fearful at this. It says the guards were so afraid that they shook and became like dead men. When that took place, after they recovered their strength, they go back to the Jewish leaders and they said this. The guards went to the city and reported to the chief priests everything that happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we'll satisfy you and keep you out of trouble." Okay? So in other words, this band of fishermen and tax collectors and these people that ran away when the guards show up to arrest Jesus before his resurrection, now somehow they're supposed to be so intimidating that the guards back down from them, or they're supposed to be so ninja-like that they can sneak in and move a stone out of the way without these guards recognizing that he did that and go in and steal the body. And a lot of holes in that story. But I especially like this account too, that's kind of a summation that Paul passes along, and he's writing this about 50 AD, so this is about 20 years or so after Jesus' death and resurrection. "What I received I passed on to you as first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that," and now notice this, "he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also." Now, what's he saying here? He's saying, there are people that you can go and talk to. You don't have to take my word for it. Here's a list of over 500 people that you can go and talk to. Now, at this point, when Paul is writing this, the persecution of the church from the Jewish religious leadership has really ramped up. And they've done a really good job of going to the non-Jewish people and whipping them into a frenzy as well. There have been some times in Paul's life that the Jewish leadership have been able to get a crowd of non-Jews so agitated at what Paul was saying that they've had him thrown into jail. And one time they stoned him to death. They thought that he was dead. They dragged him outside the city and just left his body out there. That's how much they beat him up. And so now what Paul is saying is that there is 500 plus people that are still willing to put their life on the line and say, yes, it's true, I saw him with my own eyes. Even though that may mean death for them, he said, they're alive, you can question them. Now, this is not the kind of claim that you make when it's something that you're going, once upon a time, there was a story and a guy came back to life and there were people that saw it. What people? Well, he listed some of the people that would be by name, that would be well known to the audience that he's writing to, and then he says, basically saying, and oh, by the way, if you don't believe that, I've got a list. I can give you a list of 500 more names of people that you can go and talk to. That's not how you perpetrate a myth or a legend or a story, by giving actual names of people that they can go and talk to. You are nebulous with the facts. You are a little fuzzy on the details if you're trying to make a story that you don't want somebody to punch holes in. So we can say that Jesus never actually died, he never actually came back to life, or there is a third possibility, and you can say that the claim is true, that Jesus was crucified, he did die, and he was resurrected back to life. Now, as fantastic as that might sound, one of my favorite characters is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. And Sherlock Holmes said to Watson, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Once you've punched holes in all of the other theories, the theory that has the least discrepancies, has the least holes in it, requires the least amount of going, man, we really have to stretch something to get that to work, is probably the one that is the truth. J. Warner Wallace is a cold case detective. Some of you may have seen him on NBC's Dateline. Being a cold case detective means that he doesn't have any eyewitnesses to talk to. There were no people that were there that actually saw the crime. He has to sift through all of the evidence and come to the conclusion, and yet the cases that he's presented are remarkable at how many convictions that he's gotten by the cases that he's put together. J. Warner Wallace was one of those people that didn't believe anything about God or anything about the Christian story until somebody challenged him, why don't you approach this story like a cold case detective would? And so he as well considered those three possibilities. Jesus didn't die, he died but he didn't come back to life, or he did die and he did come back to life. And here is what his conclusion is about that third option. This last explanation, although it is miraculous and a supernatural explanation, suffers from the least number of liabilities and deficiencies. If we simply enter into the investigation without a pre-existing bias against anything supernatural, the final explanation accounts for all of the evidence without any difficulty. The final explanation accounts for the evidence most simply and most exhaustively, and it is logically consistent. Yes, it does seem supernatural. It does seem like, we don't hear that. Somebody died and resurrected back to life. But like he says here, if you're going to come in with a preconceived bias and say nothing supernatural ever happens, then you're going to shut that story down. But if you come in saying, okay, that might be a possibility, then this third option, that Jesus actually died and was raised back to life, seems to fit the historical accounts and the logical evidence that we can present most clearly and with the least number of liabilities and deficiencies. It's kind of hard to make the case that he didn't actually die the death of a crucified victim. There's a lot of difficulties in making the case that the people hallucinated his resurrection or stole his body and tried to perpetrate a hoax that has lasted these 2,000 plus years. The evidence seems to point to the fact of it being true. But all of us have to come up with our own conclusion. Now, we saw a couple of those conclusions that I showed you earlier after Paul presented his case in Athens. Some people sneered. Some people said, I want to see you again, talk to you a little bit more about this. And there was a third group of people that said, that I didn't read the verse, but the next verse says there were people that believed what Paul said, and they became followers of Jesus as well. There's two men that Luke records in his gospel account that the day of Jesus' resurrection, they are utterly flabbergasted at the story. They cannot make sense of this at all. And instead of getting happy, they've actually become more depressed. They're like, this is not, none of this is making any sense. We didn't expect any of this to happen the way that it's happened. We never expected Jesus to be crucified. And now, coming back to life, what? That's not what we expected either. This is just completely, and so they're walking down the road and they're discussing this, and they're so engrossed in this and so just trying to, how do we wrap our minds around these fantastic things that have happened, that as Jesus joins them and is walking along the road with them, they can't even recognize that it's Jesus that's with them. And he says, hey guys, what are you talking about? And they're like, what are we talking about? Where have you been? This whole town is abuzz with this information. You don't understand this? And Jesus said, understand what? And they said, well, Jesus, we thought he was the prophet. We thought he was the one, but then he died. And now some people are saying that he's risen back to life, and we don't know how to make heads or tails out of this. And Jesus began to talk to them about, well, what about the prophecies? What about the things that were said before? What about this? And doing really an apologetic. And it wasn't until they finally arrived at the house of these two guys where they were going to stay and eat that finally their eyes were opened and they realized that the person that had been talking to them was Jesus, and then he disappeared from their sight. And they came back to tell everybody else, hey, it's true. We saw him as well for ourselves. But I like the phrase, as they're talking to each other, they're like, man, when he was sharing with us as we were walking along the road, didn't your heart burn inside you? I mean, wasn't there something there that just, you were kind of going, oh, boy, I really want this to be true. If this is true, this is going to make sense out of my world. I mean, this gives me hope for the future. This really kind of puts things into perspective. I really want this to be true. But the story just seems so fantastic. How can I possibly believe this? And I think that that's the case with a lot of people. They listen to the evidence. Some people say they sneer. Some people say they want to hear more. Some people believe. But I think almost everybody has a burning in their heart. I kind of want this to be true. Now, what we're going to do for the next 4 more Sundays is we're going to continue to work our way through the L, I, V, and E and continue to present this evidence. And so just as I said at the beginning, although there's some people that seem to sneer, and I just ask for your indulgence for a couple of minutes to hear the evidence, maybe some people are still at that point. You still quite haven't convinced me there. Good. We got 4 more weeks. We're going to talk about it. In the meantime, I'd love to talk about it one-on-one. We can talk about other evidence that's there. But maybe you're in that group where you say, you know, I didn't believe it before, but I'm ready to put my faith, my reasonable faith, into this evidence that Jesus was who he said he was. You should bow your heads with me this morning. Perhaps you're one of those that said, you know, if I heard it before about the death, the burial, the resurrection, I don't know that I would have believed that. But now, hearing this evidence and feeling the burning in my heart, I believe this to be true. You see, friends, the reason why Jesus had to go through all of this was not because he had done anything wrong. He was perfect. It's because we had done something wrong. It's because we are sinful. It's because we are separated from God because of our sins, and no amount of effort on our part is ever going to bridge that gap. We can never earn our way or build our way or do enough good deeds to make our way into God's presence. We will always fall short. But Jesus came and said, I will pay the price for all of those sins. I will cover the cost for everything that keeps you separated from God. You see, friend, you were made to be in a relationship with God. You were made to spend eternity in his presence and in his pleasure. In fact, that's what Jesus himself even said about heaven. He said, heaven was made for you. And Jesus paid the price so that you could go into heaven. And all it takes is belief. Belief in the fact that you are a sinner. That you can't make it to God on your own. Then belief that Jesus paid that price as he died on that cross, and belief that he was raised back to life to show you that you too will be able to have eternal life with God forever and forever. And so, my friend, I just want to lead a prayer. There's nothing magical about the words that I'm going to pray. This is just a sample, a model prayer that I have prayed and millions of people around the globe have prayed as they've invited Jesus to come into their life. And so I just invite you to pray this prayer with me. Just use my words, but turn them into your own words. Pray this from your heart. Something like this. God, I recognize that I'm separated from you. But I also acknowledge that Jesus is my only hope. That he paid the price for my sins, that he died on a cross in my place, and that he was raised back to life to show the fullness of life that I can have. And because of that belief, I invite you today, God, to come into my life. I want Jesus to be my best friend. I want him to be my master and my Lord and Savior of my life. God, I'm asking you, because of what Jesus did, to forgive me of those sins. To abolish my past record. Not because I deserve it, but because Jesus paid for it. And let me live forever with you. Thank you for this new relationship that I can start today and live out for the rest of my days and throughout eternity.